On this episode of Research Design Build, I am going to be using all of these tools to replace this half shaft. Stay tuned to watch me fumble through the replacement of this, one with a broken boot that's making a clunkety clunk clunk sound as we turn and drive, with this new one that I got from Rock Auto. We'll be doing all of this on a 1988 Honda CRX SI. The first step here is to raise the vehicle and get it up on a jack stand. Now I have already loosened the lug nut, best do that when it's on the ground. With the lug nuts removed, we can remove the tire. Now with some of these older vehicles, and especially up north, they can be kind of seized to the hub, so just give the tire, not the rim, a couple smacks and it should come off. Now I did make several mistakes while installing this new half shaft and had to redo it 3 or 4 times before I figured out what all I had done wrong. Looking on the Google, I'm not the first one to have made these mistakes. Ensure to watch the entire video if you're doing this job to ensure you save yourself some time and don't make the same mistakes I did. With the tire off, you can insert a screwdriver into the vented brake rotor like this so that you prevent it from turning as we undo the nut here for the axle. Some people say you don't have to undo the little safety detent that you punch in, but I would say you definitely do. With a breaker bar, I was not able to get it to budge. Even with a cheater bar, you can see how much my breaker bar is bending here and it's still not budging. At this point, if you're anything like me, you're going to be starting to second guess yourself. At this point, you might take off the ratchet, double check the nut, double check the safety detent, and double check that you're turning it the right way. But rest assured, this nut is just super tight, and it's going to be a bit of a fight to get it off. First mistake, don't use your best screwdriver. Not that this was, but it's not going to be straight anymore once you're done with this. The next job is to pull the little cotter pin that is sitting at the bottom of the ball joint so that we can undo that nut. The ball joint is a 17mm nut, and so we can start removing that. If I had a strong impact gun, I would be using that, but my old Milwaukee impact has probably seen better days. You can now give the knuckle a good whack to try to separate it and get the ball joint free. We're now going to tackle the bolts at the bottom of the wishbone. I believe these are also 17mm. With a 14mm socket, we can now remove the upper bolt, which is pinching down on the bottom of the strut and holding that suspension piece in place. You can now go ahead and drive out the bolt at the bottom of the little wishbone there, and I've used a punch just to push it all the way through. And check out those sway bar bushings. Those don't look a day over 34 years old. With the bottom bolt removed, we can remove the wishbone from the vehicle. You will need to sort of push down on the suspension and sort of up on the strut in order to get it out. Now we can move on to removing the axle nut fully, and this is where you need to remember to loosen this up before you start everything else. I used a hammer to punch it out a little bit. Sometimes those will be seized on there pretty good, and we are going to install some anti-seize on the new one to ensure that it slides in and out freely. With that, you can give it a bit of a tug and you should be able to pop the axle out. Now you can go underneath the car and you'll need to use a little pry bar here on the transmission to pop the inner joint out. You will have some fluid that leaks here, so make sure you have a drip pan ready. You probably shouldn't have that much fluid dripped out as long as you have just the one side of the vehicle jacked up. Most of the transmission fluid will stay in the transmission. Now we can see just how bad that half shaft was. I'm not sure how long the previous owner had driven it in this condition, but he was keenly aware of it, and he did say, yeah, you probably want to bring a trailer. This is a new one that I've got from Rock Auto. It varies just ever so slightly in design. Make sure to count all of the teeth on the splines on both sides and compare for length before installing it, because if you try to install it, they will not take it back on return. I'm giving it just a very light coat all the way around on all of the splines here going into the hub, so that this is easily removable in the future if required. It was precisely at this point that I had made my first major oops when installing this half shaft. Now, if you remember, when we removed the half shaft, we had to use a pry bar to separate it from the transmission. This is because there's a little spring clip on the end of the shaft that engages with the transmission. I did not push and fully seat the inner lines with the transmission. So right here, I had a giant gap. I need to go back under and make sure that this is pushed in and fully engaged. Now this did take quite a bit of pressure, more pressure than I was expecting it to, in order to get it seated properly. With that seated, we can install the wishbone again. All of these bushings are absolutely terrible on this car, and that is going to be another video. All of these spindles and everything else being cleaned up here. You can see the amount of grease that's on them from when that boot exploded. But that's a job for another day, and at some point I will disassemble the whole front suspension and fully clean it up before putting it back all together with new bushings. With the bottom and top bolt in, we can snug those up and then torque them to their spec. If you are doing this with new bushings, any of these bolts that are going through bushings, you want to do the final torque when they're under load. So to do this, I'd put a jack underneath the ball joint, lift up on it, and then tighten to final spec. If you tighten them in that droop position, chance for them to bind up, and then to always be kind of in that bound position and potentially tear them prematurely. The next learning for me was tightening the ball joint bolt. This one was very loose and it was just spinning and spinning and spinning on me, and I couldn't quite figure out why. I ended up switching to an impact to try that, and same thing, it was just continuing to spin. The way to fix that is to put some load on that, and what's that going to do is that's going to seat the ball joint down into its cup firmly and give you the friction you need to tighten that nut. Now here I've just put a little bit of tension on it and I'm going to try it, and it's not going to work. I actually had to jack the vehicle up substantially further before I was able to get enough friction on that lower ball joint to be able to tighten and properly torque that nut. With all the suspension all torqued down, we can now go and torque the axle nut to its torque. Again, you'll probably need to place something in the brake rotor against the brake to reach your final torque. And it's at this point that I had made my second crucial mistake. I do notice that this would not spin freely, and I couldn't quite figure out why. What ended up happening is that this axle has a slightly different machined fitting on the front of it, and this little dust boot here, although it cleared the original one, was interfering somewhat with the new axle, but only once the axle was tightened down to full torque. It has a very, very tight fit, and this is a dust boot, so that kind of makes sense. What I was able to do is clean it up and get all the grease and dirt removed, and then put it back in position, and I used a block of wood and a hammer to hammer it in a little bit further and make sure that it was seated as far in as it could. At that point, that gave me just, 0.5 millimeter or so of clearance, so that the new axle cleared just perfectly. That done, the nut tightened back in, and the security feature hammered in on the axle nut. I can go ahead and reinstall the tires, tighten down the lug nuts, torque them to spec, and get this vehicle back down on the ground. I hope this helped. It definitely took me significantly longer than it should have due to the few key mistakes that I made, where it really required me to disassemble the entire thing and try to figure out what was going wrong. Hopefully if you're watching this video, you can look out for these mistakes that I made and not make them yourself, and save you a bit of time in the garage. If you're interested in the Honda CRX, I do have 2 of them that I'm currently working on, so check back soon with the channel for more updates as I restore one and probably end up modifying quite heavily the second.